Okay, welcome to the deep dive. We're tackling a really complex figure today, Herbert Hoover.
Yeah, definitely complex.
Yeah.
And you've sent us quite a stack of material. We've got facts from historical associations, some deeper academic analysis, and also a more kind of narrative piece that explores his life story.
That's right. And our mission here in this deep dive is really to unpack all of that. We want to understand the key moments, the challenges, especially around his presidency, and, explore these really contrasting ways he's remembered.
Pull out the core insights these different views offer.
Exactly.
Absolutely. It's a life of, well, pretty stark contrasts when you look at these sources.
Mhm.
And I think to really get it, we have to start at the beginning. His early life and rise are, frankly, quite extraordinary.
Let's do it. So Herbert Clark Hoover, born in West Branch, Iowa, 1874, Quaker family.
Right, but his childhood, it was marked by loss pretty early on. He was orphaned, ended up being raised by relatives out in Newburgh, Oregon.
What a tough start. But from those difficult beginnings, he made his way.
He certainly did. That journey took him to Stanford University. That's where he met Lou Henry, who became his wife.
And what do the sources tell us about his early career, after college?
Well, he became this highly successful mining engineer, worked for a private corporation, and that job sent him really all around the world. China was a big posting.
And one source really emphasizes that, right? How he built this life defined by just remarkable capability, problem solving in really challenging places.
Yeah, definitely. And they were actually in Tianjin during a huge historical event, the Boxer Rebellion, June 1900.
Wow. What was that like based on what we've read?
Intense, really intense. For
Yeah.
almost a month, the foreign settlement where they were was under heavy fire. The Boxer Rebellion was this period of violent anti-foreign, anti-Christian feeling in China.
So what were they doing?
Well, Lou, his wife, she worked in the hospitals helping the wounded. Hoover himself was directing the building of barricades, organizing supplies. It wasn't just like a technical engineering job. He was right in the thick of it. Logistics, organization, all under literal fire.
That experience, it really does sound like a precursor, doesn't it, for what came next? Because his career took this dramatic turn towards humanitarian work just before World War I kicked off.
It really did, a major pivot. When the war broke out in 1914, he happened to be in London. The American consul general basically asked for his help. You had something like 120,000 stranded Americans trying desperately to get home from Europe.
120,000 people, and he managed to get them back in just 6 weeks.
Yeah.
That's a massive coordination effort.
It's incredible, absolutely. But that was really just the beginning. The sources go into detail about the immense challenge of feeding Belgium after the German army overran it.
Right, coordinating that aid operation must have been incredibly difficult, but so vital.
Absolutely vital work. And then, back in the U.S., President Wilson called on him during the war, asked him to head the U.S. Food Administration.
Okay, so what was his approach there, managing the nation's food supply for the war?
His task, was managing food. And he succeeded in cutting consumption of foods needed overseas. But he did it through voluntary measures. Things like meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays,
Ah, so he avoided mandatory rationing at home.
Exactly. Avoided rationing, kept the Allies supplied. It was seen as this huge administrative and logistical triumph. Really boosted his reputation.
The scale of his work is just staggering when you lay it out like that. And it didn't stop when the war ended, did it? The sources show he kept up this global relief effort.
No, he kept going. After the armistice, he was part of the Supreme Economic Council, head of the American Relief Administration, basically organizing massive food shipments for millions who were starving across Central Europe.
Millions. And he even extended aid to Soviet Russia in 1921, right? During their famine, despite all the political tension, there's that famous quote attributed to him.
There is. And it really sums up his focus then. When someone criticized him for helping the Bolsheviks, his response was just direct. 20 million people are starving. Whatever their politics, they shall be fed.
Wow.
Yeah. This whole period, it cemented his global reputation. People called him the great humanitarian, a figure whose, sheer capability saved countless lives.
So you have this incredible, celebrated career track, top engineer, world-renowned humanitarian. It almost feels inevitable that politics would be next.
It does feel that way in hindsight. His reputation for competence, his global experience, it made him a really valuable figure. He served pretty effectively as Secretary of Commerce under both Harding and Coolidge.
Yeah.
Modernized the department, pushed for efficiency.
And all that success basically positioned him perfectly for the 1928 Republican presidential nomination. He stepped into that election at a time of, what looked like booming prosperity.
Right. He ran on continuing the good times, and he made that now famous, almost tragically optimistic statement in his acceptance speech.
The one about poverty.
Yeah, we in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. The poorhouse is vanishing from among us.
Oh, hearing that quote now, knowing what was literally just months away.
Yeah.
It's haunting.
It really is. His election over Al Smith felt like, an affirmation of that prosperity, a sign that things would just keep getting better.
What's so striking, and the sources make this crystal clear, is how incredibly quickly that optimism just evaporated. Within months of his inauguration in March 29, the bottom completely fell out.
Black Tuesday.
Yeah.
October 29, 1929. The stock market crash.
And the nation didn't just dip into recession, it plummeted. It spiraled down into the Great Depression.
Yeah, the sources really stress the unprecedented speed and severity of it all. Economists, even today, decades later, still debate the precise mix of causes.
So here he is, this celebrated problem solver, the guy known for organizing massive, complex operations like feeding entire nations, suddenly facing an economic crisis of almost unimaginable scale right here at home. It's just such a brutal turn.
It really is. And his response to this crisis, well, that's where the narrative gets particularly complex and often very critical.
Okay, so what was his initial approach, according to the sources?
Initially, he tried to stick to principles of fiscal responsibility, keep the federal budget balanced, but he also cut taxes and expanded public works spending, trying to stimulate things.
But then things got worse.
Yeah, repercussions from financial collapses in Europe, particularly in 1931, just deepened the crisis even further. It became this global economic nightmare.
So he presented a more extensive program to Congress then, aimed at intervention, but maybe with a different philosophy than what came later with Roosevelt.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
He proposed creating the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC. That was designed to give financial aid, loans, basically, to struggling businesses, banks, railroads.
Okay.
There was also specific help for farmers facing mortgage foreclosures, calls for banking reform, loans to states so they could feed the unemployed, and a further expansion of public works.
Like the Hoover Dam. One source uses that as a big visual example of federal action during his term.
Exactly. Construction started under him, so he was implementing federal programs. And this is huge, but the sources highlight he had the strong conviction that while people absolutely must not starve or freeze,
Right.
providing that direct relief, caring for the unemployed, that was primarily a local and voluntary responsibility, not the federal government's main job.
And that philosophical stance, combined with just the overwhelming scale of the suffering, that became a major point of attack for his critics, didn't it?
Absolutely. His opponents in Congress, who, from Hoover's perspective outlined in some materials, were actively sabotaging his efforts for their own political gain. They successfully painted him as uncaring or inactive or just overwhelmed.
And one of the narrative sources really digs into this, asking, was that image fair? Or did he just become the ultimate scapegoat for a crisis maybe too big for any one person to fix?
Regardless of fairness, he did become synonymous with the Depression in the public mind. That image stuck it.
The images from that time are just heartbreaking, and they've lasted in our collective memory. Hoovervilles, those shanty towns that sprung up.
Long bread lines, the desperate faces of the unemployed you see in photos from the era.
And the Bonus Army incident in 1932 really sealed that image, didn't it?
It was devastating for him politically. You had these desperate World War I veterans marching on Washington, asking for early payment of a bonus they weren't technically due until 1945.
They were desperate for cash.
Totally desperate. The confrontation that followed, the military clearing their camps, the images of the camps burning, it just cemented this perception of a leader totally out of touch, maybe even hostile to the suffering of ordinary Americans.
So by the 1932 election, that perception was basically set in stone.
Yeah. He was overwhelmingly defeated by Franklin D. Roosevelt, the governor of New York at the time.
His presidency was just completely defined by that crisis and ultimately his downfall. But his public life didn't actually end there.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Which is also interesting. In the 1930s, he became a very prominent, very vocal critic of Roosevelt's New Deal. He warned constantly against what he called tendencies towards statism, basically. What he saw is way too much government control and intervention in the economy and people's lives.
But then, remarkably, he was actually called back into public service years later, wasn't he, by Truman?
Yeah, quite remarkably. President Truman appointed him to a commission in 1947. Its job was to reorganize the executive departments of the federal government.
And they elected him chairman, right? So his administrative skills were still recognized.
Exactly. His expertise was still valued. The commission made recommendations that led to quite a few government economies, streamlining things.
And he did it again under President Eisenhower in '53, chaired a similar commission.
He did. Another commission focused on government efficiency, finding ways to save money, make things run better.
It's really fascinating. After being the face of the Great Depression, his sheer competence as an administrator was still valued enough by later presidents from the other party even to bring him back to help restructure the government.
It speaks volumes about that side of him. He stayed active, wrote a huge number of articles and books in his later years. Apparently, he was still working on one when he died in New York City in 1964. He was 90 years old.
So his post-presidency really does highlight that the underlying capability was still there. It just seemed distinct from, or maybe ill-suited to, the specific massive challenge of the Depression itself.
That seems like a fair assessment based on these sources.
So, okay, let's try to connect all these dots from the sources we've looked at. You go from the orphan boy to the global engineer, the great humanitarian, then the president blamed for this unprecedented collapse, and finally back to a kind of respected elder statesman figure. What are the key insights we can pull out for you, the listener?
Well, one really powerful insight, I think, that comes through is this stark contrast between capability and context. Hoover showed extraordinary capability in very concrete areas: engineering, logistics, humanitarian relief. He could tackle huge, tangible problems.
Right.
But the Great Depression, that was a fundamentally different kind of challenge. It was this massive systemic economic breakdown driven by complex forces, maybe not even fully understood at the time. And his previous skills, his philosophical approach, they just proved insufficient or maybe ill-suited to navigate that specific storm effectively, at least in the public's eye.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that leads to another insight, doesn't it? The profound power of narrative and public perception, especially when things go really wrong.
Absolutely. The sources show Hoover did act. He implemented federal programs like the RFC. He expanded public works.
He wasn't just sitting there doing nothing.
No. But his philosophical preference for local and voluntary aid, combined with aggressive political opposition and just the undeniable overwhelming suffering people were experiencing, it allowed this narrative of inaction or even callousness to completely take hold. And that narrative overshadowed his actual efforts and ended up shaping his legacy for decades.
It really shows you that in a crisis, the story people believe can sometimes matter even more than the policy details, especially when people are scared and desperate.
Exactly. And finally, Hoover's whole story, as laid out in these materials, it forces us to confront how historical legacies get shaped. He faced circumstances, this global depression, hitting with unprecedented speed and depth that you could argue would have severely challenged any leader.
Probably true.
His experience really highlights how even highly capable individuals can end up being defined by events that might be, to some extent, beyond their full control. History sometimes seems less about a president's intentions or even their specific actions and more about the consequences felt by the people and, crucially, the narrative that wins out.
And that's really why this deep dive is relevant to you listening. Understanding Hoover's complex story gives you insights into the immense pressures leaders face during crises. It shows that complicated interplay between policy, philosophy, public opinion, and just how hard it is to navigate these massive economic storms.
It makes you think about how we judge leaders, often through the lens of the events they happen to preside over, regardless of their past achievements or, how difficult the situation truly was.
It really does make you pause and think differently about assessing leadership, especially when facing true catastrophe.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that leaves us with a final thought for you to consider as you go about your day. Given Herbert Hoover's extraordinary career saving lives and organizing massive efforts before 1929, and his continued public service reorganizing government effectively after 1933, what does his presidency, utterly defined by the Great Depression, tell us about the difference between a leader's inherent capability and the actual consequences they face when truly catastrophic, perhaps overwhelming events unfold?